6 young women knelt in the dirt outside Thaddius Bell's ranch. Their faces were streaked with tears and dust. But the man they begged for help had not spoken to another soul in 3 years, and what they were about to ask him would force him to choose between his carefully guarded solitude and something far more dangerous than loneliness. The sun beat down without mercy on the remote valley where Thaddius had built his fortress of silence. His weathered hands clenched the porch railing as he stared at the impossible sight before him. 6 figures in torn dresses, kneeling like broken dolls against the backdrop of his endless fence line. The youngest couldn't have been more than 17. The oldest perhaps 25. His throat felt like sandpaper. 3 years since he'd heard a human voice that wasn't his own echoing back from the canyon walls. 3 years since he'd deliberately chosen this existence, cutting every tie that bound him to the world beyond his property line. The nearest town was a 2-day ride through treacherous terrain. No one came here by accident, yet here they were. The woman with auburn hair lifted her head first. Her green eyes carried a desperation he recognized, though he'd spent years trying to forget that look. She opened her mouth to speak, but only a whispered croak came out. Her lips were cracked, her face hollow with exhaustion. Whatever had driven them here, they had traveled far and suffered deeply. Thaddius felt his carefully constructed walls begin to shake. Every instinct screamed at him to turn away, to retreat into his cabin and pretend this moment had never happened. He'd learned the hard way that helping others only led to pain. That trust was a luxury he could no longer afford. That the safest place was alone, always alone. But as the auburn-haired woman struggled to stand, swaying dangerously, something stirred in his chest, a feeling he'd buried so deep he'd almost convinced himself it was dead, the sense that maybe, just maybe, running away wasn't the same as being safe. The woman took a step forward, her voice barely carrying across the distance between them. Her words would shatter the silence he'd built around himself like armor, and once spoken there would be no taking them back, because what she was about to tell him would reveal that his 3 years of isolation had been nothing compared to the choice now before him. The auburn-haired woman's voice broke as she spoke, but her words cut through the desert air like a blade. "Please, mister, we ain't got nowhere else to go. They're hunting us." Thaddius tightened his grip on the porch railing, his knuckles white against the sun-bleached wood. Hunting. The word dragged up memories he'd spent years suppressing, images of another woman, another desperate plea, another moment when he'd made the wrong choice. His jaw clenched until it ached. "You need to leave," he called back, his voice rough from disuse. "I can't help you." But even as the words left his mouth, he noticed details that twisted his stomach with dread. The woman's dress wasn't just torn, it was shredded in places that spoke of violence. Dark stains marked the fabric, some that looked too much like dried blood. The other 5 women showed similar signs of rough handling. Whatever they were fleeing, it had already caught them once. The woman staggered forward another step, her hand pressed to her side. When she pulled it away, Thaddius saw fresh blood seeping through her fingers. His breath snagged in his throat. She was wounded, maybe badly. They all looked half dead from exhaustion and thirst. "They took our wagon 3 days back," she went on, her voice fading. "Killed our guide. Said they'd do worse if they caught us again. You're our last hope, mister. The only soul between here and the border." Border. The word struck Thaddius like a physical blow. These weren't just travelers in trouble, they were fugitives. Whatever danger they carried would become his the moment he offered them shelter. He'd learned that lesson once before, and it had cost him everything that mattered. But as he watched the woman sway on her feet, her face draining of color, something inside him split. She was about to collapse. They all were. And if he sent them away now, he'd be signing their death warrants as surely as if he'd pulled the trigger himself. Her legs gave out and she dropped to her knees in the dirt, her blood darkening the dust beneath her. The other women rushed to her side, their own weakness forgotten in their desperation to help her. Thaddius found himself stepping off the porch before his mind could stop him. 3 years of isolation had taught him many things, but one thing remained. but it hadn't killed the part of him that couldn't watch another human being suffer when he had the power to prevent it. As he moved toward them, a new sound reached his ears, hoofbeats, distant but closing fast, multiple horses pounding across the hard desert floor. Someone was coming, and they were riding hard. The auburn-haired woman heard it too. Terror flashed across her face as she grabbed Thaddeus's arm with blood-slicked fingers. "They found us," she whispered. "Dear God, they found us." Thaddeus turned toward the horizon where a cloud of dust was rising. Whoever was coming would be here within the hour, and when they arrived they'd find 6 women clearly on the run and 1 man about to learn that some choices can't be undone. His mind raced as he judged distances and options. The riders would reach his ranch in less than an hour. 6 wounded women couldn't outrun mounted men, not like this. But helping them meant destroying the sanctuary he'd built over 3 careful years. "Get them inside," he heard himself say, the words strange on his tongue. "Now." The auburn-haired woman, who weakly said her name was Clara, tried to protest. "We won't bring trouble to your door, mister. We can hide in the rocks." "You'll die in the rocks," Thaddeus answered flatly, already moving, his survival instincts overriding years of self-imposed withdrawal. "And those riders will find your bodies by morning. Then they'll know someone helped you." He lifted the weakest woman, a blonde barely beyond girlhood who burned with fever, into his arms. Her weight shocked him, nothing but skin and bone, lighter than a feed sack. He couldn't remember the last time he'd held another human being. The sensation felt like touching fire. The others supported each other as they staggered toward his cabin. Thaddeus noticed details that tightened his jaw with anger, rope burns on their wrists, bruises shaped like fingers around their throats. These weren't just fugitives, they were victims. Inside the one-room cabin that had been his entire world for 3 years, the women collapsed wherever they could. The contrast was jarring. The space that had once felt sufficient for a man who wanted nothing from the world now seemed painfully small and unfit for 6 desperate souls. Clara pressed her hand harder against her wounded side as she looked around. Her eyes took in the single bed, the bare furnishings, the complete absence of anything that suggested a woman had ever lived there. "You're alone," she said, and it wasn't a question. "By choice," Thaddeus replied, moving to bar the windows. "And you're about to find out why." Through the gaps in the shutters he could see the dust cloud growing. The riders were pushing hard, desperate or confident, neither possibility boding well. "Who are they?" he asked as he checked his rifle, the weight of it unfamiliar but the memory returning. Clara's face went pale. "Slavers," she whispered. "They bought us from a man who promised us work in the territories, said we'd be teachers and seamstresses." She gestured weakly to her torn dress and bruised throat. Ice formed in Thaddeus's veins. Slavers, the worst kind of predator, men who saw people as livestock and killed anyone who stood in their way. The hoofbeats were close enough now that he could distinguish individual horses, at least 6 riders, maybe more, professionals who wouldn't be scared off by a lone rancher. As Clara tried to rise again, her face twisting with pain and resolve, she spoke words that made Thaddeus's blood run cold. "There's something else you need to know. Something that makes this worse than you think." Clara's next word struck Thaddeus like a blow to the chest. "The man who sold us to the slavers, he's a federal marshal. Badge and all. Name's Wade Garrett." The rifle nearly slipped from Thaddeus's hands. A federal marshal. That changed everything. These weren't just lawless raiders he could drive off with force. If a man with a badge was involved, it meant corruption that ran deep, all the way into territorial authority. "That's why we can't go to the law," Clara went on, her voice weakening as more blood seeped between her fingers. "Garrett's got connections in 3 territories. Anyone we report to, he hears about it first, then we disappear for good." Through the window slats, Thaddeus could now see individual riders cresting the ridge that overlooked his valley. 6 men on horseback, riding with the confidence of hunters who knew they had cornered their prey. One of them wore something that caught the sun, a badge. The familiar weight of impossible choices settled on Thaddeus's shoulders. Help these women and become a target himself, or turn them away and condemn them to death. Either path led to consequences he wasn't sure he could survive. "There's a root cellar," he said at last, his voice rough with resolve. "Behind the cabin, under a false floor. I store winter supplies there. You can hide." Clara shook her head weakly. "They'll search everywhere. These men are thorough. They've been tracking us for days. They know what they're doing." The youngest woman, the feverish one, spoke for the first time. Her voice was barely a whisper, but it cut through the tension like a blade. "He's right to be scared. We bring death wherever we go." Thaddeus looked at her closely. She couldn't be more than 16, with corn silk hair and blue eyes far too old for her face. What kind of monsters sold children? The hoofbeats were close now. He could hear leather creak, men calling to each other in low, practiced tones. They were spreading out, surrounding the ranch with deliberate precision. Professionals. "Listen to me," Thaddeus said, keeping his voice steady despite the storm in his mind. "I need to know exactly what we're facing. How many men, what weapons, how far they'll go." Clara met his gaze, and in her eyes he saw a depth of suffering that made his 3 years of exile seem like a retreat. "They'll burn this place to the ground if they have to. Kill anyone who stands in their way. These aren't men with consciences, mister. They're devils wearing human skin." Through the shutters, Thaddeus caught his first clear look at the lead rider. The man sat his horse like he owned the world, his badge gleaming against a dark vest as he surveyed the ranch. Even at a distance, Thaddeus could see the cold calculation in his posture. This was Wade Garrett, a federal marshal who sold human beings for profit. Help the women and become prey, or find some way to negotiate and risk damning them all. Whatever Thaddeus chose next would decide who lived to see another sunrise. The riders reined in just outside rifle range, close enough to speak but far enough to avoid immediate danger. Garrett raised his voice, and it carried clearly across the desert air. "Afternoon, friend. We're looking for some runaway property. 6 women who stole themselves from their rightful owners. You seen anyone like that around here?" Thaddeus stepped onto his porch, rifle loose in his hands but ready. The afternoon sun stretched long shadows across the yard as he faced 6 mounted men who radiated menace like heat from a forge. Marshal Garrett sat his horse at the center, his badge bright against his vest. "Haven't seen anybody," Thaddeus called back, his tone flat, shaped by years of solitude. "Don't get many visitors out here." Garrett's smile was cold as winter stone. "Is that so? Mind if we take a look around? Sometimes folks hide in places they think nobody'll find them." Inside the cabin, Thaddeus could hear faint sounds, women struggling to keep their breathing quiet. Clara had gone silent, likely unconscious from blood loss. The fevered girl still burned. None of them could run, even if there was somewhere to go. "This is private property," Thaddeus said. "And I don't recall inviting you to search it." One of Garrett's men, a scarred brute with dead eyes, spat tobacco into the dust. "Federal authority trumps private property, hermit. You hiding something, or you just naturally unfriendly?" Sweat beaded on Thaddeus's brow despite the dry heat. These men weren't here to bargain. They'd already decided he was guilty of something. The only question was how far they'd go. "Funny thing about hermits," Garrett said, dismounting with easy grace. "They usually choose isolation, 'cause they got secrets. What's yours, friend?" He stepped closer, his hand resting casually on his pistol. "We've been tracking those women for 3 days. Lost their trail about a mile from here, right where the ground turns hard. Makes me think a clever man helped them cover it. Question is why?" The moment balanced on a knife's edge. Behind Thaddeus, a soft whimper of pain slipped from the cabin. Barely audible, but in the desert stillness it might as well have been a shout. Garrett's head tilted slightly, like a wolf catching scent. What was that? Wind, Thaddius said quickly. Loose board in the roof. But Garrett was already drawing his weapon with smooth precision. Boys, I think our hermit friend's been keeping secrets. Let's have us a look inside. The other men dismounted together, efficient and practiced. Professionals. Thaddius knew then that words were no longer enough. As Garrett stepped onto the porch, boots creaking on weathered wood, his voice dropped into a promise of violence. Here's how this goes. You step aside, we collect our property. Anyone interferes gets buried out here where nobody'll ever find him. As Garrett reached for the cabin door, Thaddius made his choice. The decision that had been forming since the moment he saw 6 desperate women in his yard. He raised his rifle in one smooth motion, the barrel stopping inches from Garrett's chest. The marshal froze, surprise flickering in his eyes. I said this is private property, Thaddius repeated, his voice deadly calm. And I meant it. For a heartbeat, the world seemed to hold its breath. 6 guns swung toward Thaddius from the yard, but his rifle never left Garrett's heart. The marshal's expression shifted, surprise giving way to anger, then to a cold respect. You're making a mistake, Garrett said softly. A big one. Those women belong to us. Bought and paid for. You're interfering with legal business. Legal? Thaddius let out a bitter laugh. Slavery's been illegal for years, Marshal. Even out here. Garrett's thin smile returned. These ain't slaves. They're indentured servants. Signed contracts. Debts to pay. From inside the cabin came Clara's voice, weak but fierce. Lies. We never signed anything. He drugged us, took us from a church social in Kansas. Garrett's face darkened. Sounds like you've got stolen property in there, friend. Property that's making you do foolish things. The standoff stretched tight. Thaddius knew the numbers. 7 armed men against 1, with 6 wounded women in the middle. Even if he killed Garrett, the others would cut him down. But sometimes numbers didn't matter. Sometimes a man had to stand anyway. Here's what's going to happen, Thaddius said, his voice carrying absolute resolve. You're getting back on your horses. You're forgetting you ever saw this place or these women. And you're finding a new line of work. Garrett's scarred lieutenant shifted, gun hand twitching. Boss, say the word. Garrett raised a hand, never breaking eye contact with Thaddius. Something had changed in his gaze. He was seeing something he hadn't expected. A man already at peace with dying. You know what I think, Garrett said slowly. I think you've been here before. Failed to help someone once, and now you're trying to make up for it. The words struck deep. Buried memories clawed to the surface. Another woman. Another plea. Another moment of cowardice. Touched a nerve. Garrett pressed. What was she, wife, sister, daughter? Thaddius's grip tightened, his aim steady. Her name was Sarah. She was my wife. And I won't make the same mistake twice. Garrett nodded, as if confirming something. Sarah. Pretty name. Bet she died screaming, knowing you were too scared to save her. Rage exploded in Thaddius's chest. For a split second, his finger tensed on the trigger, ready to end Garrett regardless of the cost. And then he heard Clara's voice from inside, faint but clear. Thaddius, that's him. The man who killed your wife. The words hit like lightning. Wade Garrett, the name he'd spent 3 years trying to bury. The man who'd come to his homestead with promises of protection, who'd demanded Sarah as payment, who'd laughed when Thaddius begged. Garrett's eyes gleamed with recognition. Well now, Thaddius Bell. The coward of Willow Creek. I wondered what became of you after you ran off like a whipped dog. The rifle trembled in Thaddius's hands, not with fear, but with rage sharpened by truth. You killed her. I didn't kill her, Garrett said smoothly. You did, by being too yellow to fight. She called your name when she died, wondered where her brave husband went. Something broke inside Thaddius. The walls around his grief, the excuses, the lies, all collapsed. But here's the best part, Garrett went on. History's about to repeat. Only this time, instead of one woman, you've got 6. And you're going to watch me take every one of them. Clara's voice rose, fueled by fury. He's lying. Sarah Bell died fighting. I know because I was there. I was one of the women he took before her. The world tilted. Thaddius turned his head slightly, never fully taking his eyes off Garrett. What? Blonde hair, blue eyes, scar on her left hand, Clara said, strength building. She fought like a wildcat. Broke one man's nose, nearly blinded another. When she died, she wasn't calling for you. She was cursing his name. Garrett's smile faltered. Shut up. But Clara didn't. She told me about you. Said you promised to come for her. She died believing you would. Thaddius's breath left him in a shudder. For 3 years he'd carried the certainty of cowardice. I searched for weeks, he whispered. Every trail, every town. Garrett recovered, but his posture had changed. Touching story. Changes nothing. His hand moved toward his gun, but Thaddius was already pulling the trigger. The rifle's thunder tore through the desert air, and Wade Garrett was hurled backward off the porch, his chest erupting red as he hit the ground hard. Chaos exploded across the ranch yard. Garrett's 5 remaining men opened fire in the same instant, bullets ripping through wood, splintering the porch rail, shattering glass. Thaddius dove behind a water trough, working the rifle's lever by instinct, the motions coming back as if the last 3 years had never happened. The man who had spent that time running from violence remembered how to fight, but he also understood the truth of the moment. 5 professional killers against 1 rancher, with 6 wounded women trapped in the middle. The odds were merciless. He knew he had maybe 30 seconds before they overwhelmed him. Then Clara appeared in the cabin doorway. Blood soaked her dress, her face was pale, but her hands were steady as she leveled a shotgun she had found inside and fired both barrels into the nearest rider. The man screamed as he toppled from his horse. The root cellar, she shouted over the gunfire. There are more weapons down there. The other women followed her out like something reborn, each carrying rifles or pistols taken from Thaddius's hidden stores. They were wounded, exhausted, barely standing, but they had found something stronger than fear. Their freedom, and the knowledge that someone was finally willing to die for it. The fight that followed was short and savage. Caught in crossfire from porch and cabin, Garrett's remaining men broke. 2 more fell before they reached their horses, bodies slamming into the dirt as the survivors fled hard for the horizon. Silence crashed down just as suddenly as the gunfire had risen. Dust drifted in the late light. Thaddius stepped out slowly, his ears ringing, his hands shaking now that it was over. He knelt beside Wade Garrett's body. The man who had haunted his nights for 3 years lay still, eyes staring, badge dull with blood. The victory felt empty. Sarah was still gone. Nothing could return what had been taken, and the years of self-imposed exile could not be undone. Clara knelt beside him, her own pain forgotten. She'd be proud of you, she said quietly. Sarah would be proud you finally fought back. Thaddius looked up at the 6 women who had altered everything by refusing to surrender. Clara, bleeding but unbroken. The feverish girl, eyes clearer now, holding herself upright through sheer will. 4 others whose names he did not yet know, all standing when it mattered most. What will you do now? He asked. Clara managed a tired smile. We talked about it while you were saving our lives. There's a town 2 territories north that needs teachers. Good people who won't ask too many questions. She studied him. And you? Going back to hiding in this valley? Thaddius glanced around at the ranch. The place that had been both refuge and cage for 3 years. The silence he had cherished felt hollow now, not peaceful. The solitude that once protected him seemed like another form of dying. "No," he said, surprised by how certain he felt. "I think I've been alone long enough." 6 months later, a one-room schoolhouse in the territory of New Haven opened its doors to 6 new teachers. Women who had learned that freedom was worth any price. Their friend Thaddius built the school with his own hands, shaping every desk and window frame with the same care he had once used to build walls around his heart. Clara married him on a spring morning when wildflowers painted the desert with color. She wore Sarah's wedding ring with pride, knowing some loves are strong enough to bless new beginnings. The fever-sick girl, whose name was Grace, grew tall and strong, becoming the finest teacher in 3 territories. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the wind moved just right, Thaddius thought he heard Sarah's voice carried on the desert breeze, telling him she was proud of the man he had finally chosen to become.